Right, welcome back everybody to our video serialization. Sounds very dramatic, doesn't it? Of Dr. Dave Regis's ebook. I believe you can find from the website of the Exeter Chess Club. The good doctor's been kind enough to allow me to turn it all into videos for him. And the idea is he's providing a repertoire of openings for new players and junior players and beginner players. And as we've discovered so far, there's definitely some stuff in it for us old fogies as well. And we're looking at answers against E4 for black. And Dr. Dave recommends the French defense. In the previous video, we just looked at some very brief traps and a few points about the French defense in general. And I've got 4 more games for you up. Dr. Dave's got 4 more games for you today that I'm just going to put on the board and commentate a little bit. They're all quite quick ones here, so it shouldn't take too long. And our first game is Kazanitsky and Rachko from Bratislava in 1998. So I don't think any of the players named today are grandmasters. I don't think. I think they're just local players in a tournament. Strong players, but nonetheless, I don't think they're grandmasters. Okay, apologies if I've done anyone an injustice. And we carry on. So d4 from white, d5 from black, and knight to d2. So white tries this system, as discussed the other day in the other video. Knight to f6. 2 pieces are now hitting this square. So white has to do something and moves the pawn forward, e5. Knight f to d7. Bishop to d3. This is all typical stuff. c5. Remember, we have to do this before we put the knight on c6. It's very important that black has this pawn here to challenge on d4. And c3 from white, so defending, sorry, not there, defending. This square becomes quite the battleground frequently in the French defense. Knight to c6, so another piece on that square. Knight d to f3, this, that's cheating. This knight, rather than this one, because this one can come here to be another defender of d4 in some games. But in this game, black plays queen to a5, which is very clever. That actually puts pressure on this square by pinning this pawn. So this pawn can't capture now because it would be queen takes king, would be no good. And so white decides to put something in the way to break the pin. And white plays queen to d2. But as you'll notice from the bar shooting off towards the top of the page, this is actually a mistake. It's a mistake because after pawn takes, if pawn recaptures, bishop to b4 just wins the white queen. The bishop is pinning the queen to the king, so the queen can't move because that would be illegal, and there's no way you can put anything on c3 to block. So white has to lose queen for bishop, which is no good. And it's worth noting that if knight takes, pawn takes, bishop here is still just as deadly, and the queen is lost. So actually what has to happen in this position is white simply has to accept that they've messed up and they've lost a pawn. And it's a very ugly position as well, by the way. All I would say, however, is going back to this position, white had the right idea by blocking the pin. Bishop to d2 is okay. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. As you can see, computer's saying basically dead level. And the other way you can undo this pin, which is a little odd because you wouldn't normally want to knock castle in a game of chess, but you can actually just slide the king to f1. And now this pin is broken and the pawn defends d4 and the game goes on quite equally. Okay, so that was our first one for today. Our second one, we've got Podgaetsky and Soshnikov from Kharkov in 2002. Again, don't know if they're master players or title players at all, but let's see how they get on. And what is interesting with this game is in the final position where white resigns, actually with further analysis, they could have carried on and had a slight advantage to black in the final position, but it really should have carried on. But let's see the game. d4, d5, knight to d2, knight to f6. So very similar to last time. This is all known theory. So you play the same few moves each time. Bishop to d3, c5, c3. This will all look quite familiar based on the last game. Knight to e2, and this time black changes slightly from the previous game with knight to b6, b3 from white, bishop to d7 from black. Slight advantage to white at the minute, says the computer. which makes sense because computers really like the space advantage for white in the French defense. Move 9, knight to f3, rook to c8 from white. So if pawn takes back, and then maybe the rook has a nice line to play on. Bishop to d2 from white. Oh, and sure enough, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. And now knight b4 from black, attacking this bishop. The bishop is defending, the black bishop's defending the knight, so the knight can be taken, it can be swapped off, or white can simply retreat the bishop. And white wants to keep this bishop, so they choose to go back to b1, which is fine. They didn't want to allow the knight to swap itself for what white thinks is a really strong piece, so perfectly reasonable. Bishop to b1, understandable. Bishop b5 is played by black. And then bishop g5 from white, so attacking the black queen, and the bishop is defended. Computer doesn't think it's the strongest move in the world, but it's still relatively level. It's not a complete disaster. I think the point about this, though, is that black probably wants to put the queen on c7 anyway. So this bishop being here is kind of just helping black do what they want to do, arguably. But queen to c7, and then white castles. And so Dr. Dave writes in the book, in this position, the bishop on b1 looks like a good piece, but it can't move. Well, indeed, it can't. Look at all the possible squares that it could go to, and none of them are actually safe. And because this bishop can't go anywhere, neither can this rook. So in this position, although it's only saying a slight advantage to black, white is almost playing a rook down, look. And what actually happens in the game in this position is black plays bishop takes knight, queen takes is pretty much forced, otherwise you've just lost a piece. Queen here attacking this trapped rook, and white resigns because there's no real way to get to the rook. If you try to move the bishop out of the way to defend the rook that way, well then queen takes bishop, queen takes, knight takes, you just win anyway. But you'll notice, if you're very eagle-eyed, that white didn't need to resign. I say eagle-eyed because if you notice the bar, it's saying it's only a small advantage to black. But surely black's about to win a rook. Well, in the day and age of computers where we are now, the computer can actually see a way out of this for white. I say out of it, I mean, in the final position, it's still a little bit better for black, but certainly white doesn't need to resign. What should happen is here, queen here. Rook has to block because there's a check. Well, it doesn't have to block. Well, actually, something has to block. And the rook's the best way to do it. So rook to c6. And then queen to a5. And I mean, this is just going to... I could never have seen this in a million years. I have to say, as white, I think I'd have probably resigned as well, thinking I'd lost the rook. The computer says, no, queen to a5. Black can grab the rook if they want. But now after queen here, because this bishop guards these two squares... and the queen is now attacking here, is attacking here, might be threatening some rather unpleasant checks. Black actually has a few difficulties to sort out. And I'll put the lines back. I think the computer's going to say rook to c8 is the best move, or knight to c8, either's okay. But let's put rook to c8 because, yeah, whatever. Rook to c8. Queen can now take the knight, or queen takes pawn. Let's go with queen takes pawn. Now from here, the queen is not really threatening the rook because the knight defends, but she is threatening the knight. And if you move the knight, you lose the rook and you get checkmated. Yeah, so that's not great. And so the computer gives us the best thing that black can do, to actually just accept that the knight is gone. Queen to c3, queen takes, queen to c6, I believe is the best move. Remember, this bishop defends this knight. And after queen takes, knight takes, after all that, slight advantage to black, but certainly not enough that white should be resigning the game. I mean, that's all near enough level. And in fact, the lower the level you're playing chess at, that pretty much is level. Even with grandmasters, minus 0.4 is, you know, it's basically dead level. But I have to say, I totally understand why, in an age pre-computers, that just looks like you've lost a whole rook. Isn't that remarkable that in that position, white actually can play on with the queen check and the series I've just showed you? But yeah, still a very nice game for the French defense there. Okay, so our next one isn't a full game. We're not going to see a full game here. We're just going to see a sort of typical structural thing in the French defence. And our game is Guibert against Culpa from Aix-les-Bains in France in 2003. Again, no idea if these are just strong club players or master players. It doesn't matter. Oh, let's turn the lines off. And we've got e4, e6, d4, d5. Okay, fine. Knight d2. There are other moves than knight d2, I promise. Knight f6 and e5, knight f to d7. So you're certainly learning this pattern. Bishop to d3, c5, c3, knight to c6, knight to e2. And this time black goes for the early pawn exchange. Okay, fine, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. And now you can't hit at this with a pawn because you've already swapped. So you have to do something to try and break up this white center, this strong wedge in the center. And so black tries the move f6, which sometimes is a good idea in the French defense. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Computer says basically level-ish, give or take at the minute. And white decides to defend this with f4. Okay, computer now saying still pretty level, maybe a tiny edge to black. In our game, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. And now black has rather a nice move. And the nice move is knight takes pawn. And we just give the computer a minute or two to think about it, but it will then say tiny advantage to black here. Well, why? It will eventually, I would think, go slight advantage to black. Let it think about it. At the very least, it's dead level. Why? Well, the point is, if knight takes, then black will play queen here check. And white will do something to get out of the check, probably G. There we go. I told you it would sooner or later, it would decide it was advantage to black. It just took it a few seconds to think about it. And whether you move king to F1 or play pawn to G3, in either case, let's play G3 because that's what's suggested. After queen takes knight, black is a pawn up. There's 6 black pawns and only 5 white ones. Now, don't get me wrong, this position is it's just a million miles away from being winning or over, but black's a pawn up. So yeah, you've got to say that's not a bad little trick in the middle of the board. I mean, this one is in some trouble. White's going to have to do something to defend this pawn. So if you see the queen's attacking 2 pieces, you're probably going to have to play knight f3 as the only move. The queen's attacked now, so the queen will get out of the way, possibly b4 with check, more likely b6, because from here it stops white from castling. And yeah, slight advantage to black. If black can get untangled here, get developed and get castled, yeah, they're just going to be a straight pawn up. And it's even a passed pawn. And a passed pawn means one with no enemy pawn in front of it. So it's got a clear run to the other side to become a queen. So we're not saying going to see the end of that game, but I think Dr. Dave just wanted us to see that little tactical trick with knight takes d4 in the middle of the board. Excuse me, sorry, that knight takes d4 in the middle of the board and how that can be quite good for black. Okay, so one more in this video. As I say, I want to keep them short and sweet and bite-sized. So here we've got Fiakan and Kolchak from Slovakia in 1997. Let's see how these two get on. E4, E6, D4, D4, D5. And in this game, white played the exchange variation. Okay, takes and takes. And then Dr. Dave, as you may remember, playing as white against the French defense recommends the Monte Carlo, C4, which leads to some interesting chess. But in the game we're looking at, white played C3, which is just mega solid, mega safe. I can't criticize it. It's not like it's losing, but goodness me, it's not the most exciting move you're ever going to see. And the computer is saying 0.00. It couldn't think that the position's any more level if it tried. Symmetry with pawns, look, 4 against 4 on this side, 3 against 3 on this side. It's the same pattern. Both sides have developed the same number of pieces, i.e. none. Yeah, really, really, really level position. You can't knock it because it's not losing, but it's not terribly thrilling. Anyway, bishop to d6, bishop to d3. Fine. And now black does something to a little bit out of the ordinary. You'd probably expect knight f6 here, but black plays queen to f6. And white must be encouraged to do something odd too, because white plays queen to h5. And the obvious idea is to put the bishop here. Black's not scared. Knight to e7 and bishop to g5 as predicted. Queen e6 from black, and at least there is something going on the board now. Computer says tiniest of tiny edges to white, nothing to worry about. But we are in check. And so in our game, white plays knight to e2 to block the check. And black goes for a queen trade, queen to g4. Remember, the bishop is defending the queen, so it's not just a blunder. White obliges, queen takes, bishop takes, and all looks absolutely well here, doesn't it? The computer says a tiniest of tiny edges to white, but really nothing to write home about. Okay, positions level. And then this. And all of a sudden we have a problem. As you can see, the computer's decided now that it's -3. It'll probably get to -4 if I leave it to run. And white's just lost pretty much on the spot. So if you want to press pause here and see if you can find the right next move for black that wins a piece and therefore in our game forced white to resign, feel free to press pause and have a go. Otherwise, I will carry on with the move in 3, 2, and 1. And the killing move here, the killer blow, is f6. Why? Well, first of all, it attacks the bishop. So the bishop's got to make a decision now. Is it going to move? Well, it can't go here because the other pawn will take there. Yeah, so okay, so bishop here, pawn takes. It can't stay there because it gets taken. If it retreats here, well, then it's not defending the knight anymore, and black just plays bishop takes knight. So what on earth are you going to do? You've got no way to save the position. You could try playing a similar move, pawn here, but black's got plenty of safe places to retreat the bishop. Presumably d7 or c8's okay. In either case, I guess that's fine. And yeah, then you're back to square one. You've still got no way to save your bishop unless you're happy to lose the knight. And yeah, that's why in the game that we were looking at, white resigned. Yeah, very nasty, would have been a piece down. Okay, that will do for today, or for that video anyway. And I will be back soon with another 4 games from the black point of view in the French defense. Hope this is all very helpful, and thanks for watching. See you soon.